And now I would like to introduce a man known to many of you. Howard Zinn is a teacher, a historian, and a playwright. He has written 10 books, including one of the most important books of our era, I think, A People's History of the United States. I've met people in Europe, in Asia, and in Africa who tell me what wonderful history books we have in this country. And I say, you've got to be kidding. And they said, no, Mr. Zinn's History of the United States. They think that's the standard textbook in this country. His plays include Emma and Daughter of Venus. And it's my pleasure to ask him to address you now. Howard Zinn.
Thanks. I know you're applauding me just because I have the nerve to substitute for John Kenneth Galbraith. Can you all hear me? Yeah. Well, I've always admired John Kenneth Galbraith, and I wish him well. I hope he gets better soon. In the year 1948, there was a series of pamphlets were distributed by the House Committee on Un-American Activities entitled 100 Things You Should Know About Communism. I came across this in my files. I keep files on them. It's only fair. I was impressed by the thought that the committee knew 100 things about communism. Anyway, the pamphlets had 100 questions and answers. Question 1, what is communism? So the idea is to start with something easy. Something that requires a brief answer. Answer, a system by which one small group seeks to rule the world. The answer was probably drawn up by the people who later founded the Trilateral Commission. Can I skip to question 76? Where can a communist... What was that? Mike? Is that better? Yeah, okay. Don't want you to miss this. Question 76. Where can a communist be found in everyday life? Well, this question particularly interested me because there had been times when I was in need of a communist. I didn't know where to find one. Answer, look for him in your school, your labor union, your church, or your civic club. Question 86. Is the YMCA a communist target? This really worried me. I always wondered why there was so much chlorine in the YMCA swimming pool. But answer, yes. So is the YWCA. Anyway, let's skip to the year 1987, the year of the investigation of Contragate. Robert McFarlane, who you may remember, conspired with Poindexter, Casey, North, Secord, and almost certainly George Bush to violate the laws and the Constitution. I'm going to listen for his pledge. to give weapons to terrorists in Central America. And I imagine that McFarlane, as a school child, probably distributed those leaflets, those pamphlets put out by the House Un-American Activities Committee to raise money to go to college so he could prepare himself for his career and to enable him to pass the courses in political theory. He was a national security advisor to the president and later said he knew that the policy of illegally getting arms to the countries wouldn't work. Not that it was wrong, of course, but it wouldn't work. And he said, succinctly put, which is very, well, where I went wrong was in not having the guts to stand up and tell the president that. To tell you the truth, probably the reason I didn't is because if I had done that, Bill Casey, Gene Kirkpatrick, and Cap Weinberger would have said, I was some kind of a commie, you know. This really intrigued me. Robert McFarlane, some kind of a commie. Well, yes, we do know. Yeah. In fact, I was looking around here in the Memorial Hall thinking he might have registered for this conference. I don't really understand why he was hesitant to speak his mind to the president, because once in an interview, McFarlane said, I had countless talks with the president when I felt he wasn't absorbing what I was telling him. All of you can come up, I'm sure, with absurdities like this. The history of, it's such a rich, poor history. You think of, I don't know, I'm thinking of the time Harold Veld, Congressman of Illinois, stood up in the House to oppose the money for mobile libraries. And he's also in my files. He said, mobile library service in rural areas, you see. He said, quote, educating Americans through the means of the library service could bring about a change of their political attitude quicker than any other method. The basis of communism and socialistic influence is education of the people. All this, it is a little bizarre, a little laughable. But of course, it represents something terribly serious, because there are certain words which are calculated to stop serious thinking, and stop rational discourse and arouse hatred. Words which are murderous. And we've seen words used that way in our time, as in other times. The word Jew, the word nigger, and leading to mass murder, lynchings, enslavement. And the word communist, of course, used in our time perhaps more than anything else to support the propping up of dictatorships all over the world, Pinochet and Marcos and the Shah, and in El Salvador and Guatemala, and the invasion of other countries, and the bombing of peasant villages, and the destruction of the economy of a small neighboring country. I'm talking about Nicaragua. And the robbing of the hard-earned salaries of so many Americans to finance these thousands of billions of dollars of stupid weapons. So these words are serious. They're murderous. They're depleting of our wealth and our energy. Here's a news dispatch from Seattle in June '86. Quote, a self-proclaimed soldier against communism faces a death sentence over a verdict today by a jury that found him guilty of murdering 4 members of the Charles Goldmark family. He murdered 4 members of the family because he thought they were part of an international conspiracy among communists, Jews, and the Federal Reserve Board. Actually, I thought he was quite sane until he came to the Federal Reserve Board, because the rest of it just fits in with Richard Nixon. So these are words designed to stop rational discussion, even rational discussion of communism. And I think we do need sober, serious discussion of communism, of socialism. We need discussion of the Soviet Union. We need criticism of the Soviet Union. On my part, I feel we need anger and indignation at the Soviet Union for some of the things that have happened there and some of the things that have been done to people over there. I believe that the policies of the Soviet Union have given socialism a bad name. And I want socialism to have a good name, you see, because the socialism that I grew up with, socialism for me got a good name with Karl Marx, whom I knew personally, and Eugene Debs, Helen Keller. A lot of people don't know Helen Keller was a socialist. And how she was red-baited, and how she was put down because of her views. Emma Goldman. Socialism had a good name, but there's a difference between a kind of reasonable criticism you could have of communism, socialism, of the Soviet Union, of governments, of states, whatever they call themselves, a difference between that kind of criticism or indignation and the kind of murderous, indiscriminate hatred which leads us to threaten to drop bombs to kill all of the citizens of this country, presumably the citizens of governments where the citizens themselves are victims. We're prepared to kill all of them, presumably to save them, as we've always been ready to kill people to save them from communism. The most recent murderous use of the term communism was in the Vietnam War, where it was used to justify everything. There's one word used to justify a 10-year war and the dropping of 7 million bombs and the dispatch of 500,000 troops and the destruction of the country. And a man named Charles Hutto from Louisiana told the Criminal Investigation Division of the U.S. Army, quote, "I remember the unit's combat assault on My Lai 4. The night before the mission, we had a briefing by Captain Medina. He said, everything in the village was communist. So we shot men, women, and children." And he now lives in Monroe, Louisiana with a wife and 2 children, and he says, "I was 19 years old and I'd always been told to do what the government, what the grown-ups told me to do, but now I'll tell my sons, if the government calls, use your own judgment. Now I don't even think there should be a thing called war because it messes up a person's mind. It can mess up a whole nation's mind." And it's done that. Now this is Veterans Day, by the way, right? It's Veterans Day. We should remember. Veterans Day is a good day to remember the numbers of people who've been killed because of murderous words used by governments all over the world. So it's instructive, I think, to see that later thought of this infantryman who was there at the My Lai massacre, because I think it suggests that this country was not the same in its reaction to those words after the Vietnam War as it was when the war first began. I think there was a great learning that took place as a result of the Vietnam War. And that millions of Americans, I think, have learned to think twice about the cry of communism, and I think that's why the American people are not ready to support an invasion of Nicaragua just because it's a Marxist dictatorship and communism is there, and it's on our southern flank, which is, a very deft threat to our biological functions. But people don't really go along with that. And they can't whip up the sentiment as they once used to be able to do more easily. And I think that's a result of learning. There's a way in which the word communist can get boring. And I think, there are some people who are never bored by it, of course, but there's a way in which it can get boring when directed again and again and again and again at all sorts of targets. They're communist, this is communist, that's communist. 10 cents more an hour, communist. I think interesting things have happened. The civil rights movement was interesting. I've met a bunch of friends here who, from those days, are from the South, and I think they will corroborate this. The movement, and I'm thinking now of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and I'm thinking of the people around them, people in Mississippi and Alabama. The accusations of communism made against the civil rights movement, and they just didn't stick, they didn't mean anything. Because when people are engaged in the struggle, when people are facing the realities and they know what's right and wrong, it's very clear, then you can yell communist all you want. It's not going to mean very much. And the people in the civil rights movement, the people in SNCC, sloughed off when Theodore White started talking about the dark influences, right? Dark influences to a black movement? Or when, columnists and all these... Or Harry Truman in 1960, that's right, Truman. Yeah, he was out of the White House, but still around. And Truman, in 1960, when the sit-ins began, said he was sure that there were communists behind it. He didn't have any proof, he said. When asked for proof, you don't ask an ex-president for proof. You don't ask a president for proof, right? But he said he knew that wherever there was trouble, that probably communists were behind it. So I think we learned a lot. I think we're maturing in this respect. We're maturing and we're learning the way people in other countries have learned, very often the hard way, that the use of the word communist in American foreign policy meant a way of justifying the smashing of governments that we didn't like and setting up of brutal dictatorships that we did like. I'm looking at the clock, right? And because I can't see the faces of the people behind me, and I feel there's certain something building up. But let me just this way. There's so much to do, right? There's so much to do. There's so many problems to solve. There are people out there who don't have a place to live. There are people who can't pay their rent, right? There are people in hospitals who don't have... There are people in the corridors of some of the best medical centers of the country who are waiting in the corridors because there aren't enough doctors and nurses to take care of them. There are old people who can't go down in homes, can't go down to the dining room because there's nobody to push their wheelchair because there's no money for this. And there's money for the B-1 bomber, and there's money for the stealth bomber, and there's money for the Trident, right? There's money for all those stupid instruments of death. There are real problems out there, real problems in the world, real things that we have to do. And then we need a debate about these things. We need to discuss these things. We need an open debate. No holds barred. Communism, socialism, capitalism, democracy, liberty, everything. Nobody should be afraid. People who themselves are accused should not be afraid. People accused of liberalism should not be afraid. People accused of being communists should not be afraid. We should talk about class. We should talk about internationalism. We should talk about racism. We should talk about one world. We should talk about unilateral disarmament. Nobody should ever say that, right? Never. There are some things you should never say. We should talk about all of these things. And for that, you must have nothing standing in the way. I just want to end. People in the arts, and I was thinking of that when I met John Henry Falk, whom I met not long ago when we discovered, we had known one another, a really super guy in the arts, and he was one of those people who's blacklisted, and so on. And so on. It's very simple, the thing being blacklisted. But I thought people in the arts always admired. I always thought they were, ahead of everyone. Very often had more courage than anybody else. They sang their thing, they played their thing, they spoke their thing. I wanted to end. I just I have to interpolate this. I remember Joseph Papp was being questioned by the House Un-American Activities Committee, and they asked him if he had introduced any communist stuff into his plays. He said, well, I do Shakespeare. Said, to thine own self be true. And Ahrens, the staff director, interposed. He said, we are not saying that William Shakespeare was a communist. I want to just close with the statement that Bertolt Brecht prepared to make to the House Un-American Activities Committee. They never let him make it. But this is what Brecht was going to say. This is part of what Brecht was going to say. We are living in a dangerous world. Our state of civilization is such that mankind already is capable of becoming enormously wealthy, but as a whole is still poverty-ridden. Great wars have been suffered. Greater ones are imminent, we are told. Do you not think that in such a predicament, every new idea should be examined carefully and freely? Well, I hope that's what we'll do in these few days here. Thank you.
Tonight's symposium is Choosing the News, Who Sets the Agenda. We want to look a bit closely at the mechanisms by which certain facts about certain events around the country and around the world are selected for presentation to the general public in the mainstream media as, quote, the news, close quote. And in the context of the theme of this conference, we want to examine the proposition that anti-communist biases or myths, conscious or subliminal, on the part of reporters or editors or publishers or corporate owners or a combination thereof might affect that selection. We have an extremely distinguished panel before us tonight, and I will introduce them in alphabetical order. 2 places to my right is Joanne Ball, who has been a staff writer at the Boston Globe for 6 years, recently traveled to Mozambique and wrote a very important series of articles on that country in your local paper. On my immediate left, I should say on my extreme left, Alexander Coburn. Alex is a media...
already? Hear that?
A media critic and a columnist for the Nation magazine, the Wall Street Journal, and the LA Weekly. A selection of his writings entitled Corruptions of Empire has recently been published and is on sale at this conference, and but for the one piece in it attacking me, it's quite a good book. At the end of the table is Gianfranco Corsini. Mr. Corsini has been a journalist for more than 30 years, having been the editor of Paese Sera, a correspondent for La Stampa, and at present a special correspondent for L'Unità of Rome. Next to the end on my right side, Carl E. Meyer is an editorial writer at the New York Times. Before moving to the Times, he spent 15 years at the Washington Post. And I should tell you that he's one of the few people in this room, perhaps, who ever actually had Joseph McCarthy for his senator. Mr. Meyer is a native of Wisconsin and a graduate of the University of Wisconsin. And he wrote his PhD at Princeton on the roots of McCarthyism. To my immediate right is Terry Shaw. Ms. Shaw spent 18 years on the Washington Post foreign desk, still writes for the Washington Post, made numerous trips to Latin America, and has written frequently on both Cuba and Nicaragua. At the far end of the table, Mr. William Styron, who may not need an introduction, but is in fact one of this country's leading novelists, and among his many books are The Confessions of Nat Turner and Sophie's Choice. 2 to my left, is Mr. Wilbert A. Tatum, who is the publisher and editor-in-chief of the New York Amsterdam News. Mr. Tatum was Deputy Borough President of Manhattan. He was a director of the Office of Midtown Planning and Development there. Let me note at the outset that each of our distinguished panelists appears here as an individual and not as a representative, as an official representative of his or her organization. And I will assure the panelists that although we might ask them about various actions of the papers or magazines for which they write, with the possible exception of Mr. Tatum, who is an owner and must be more answerable than some of the others who are employees, we are not going to hold them responsible for everything which happens at their workplaces. We will leave some time at the end of the panel for questions from the audience. Let me begin by raising one topic for discussion and then turning it to some of our panelists. I think there is no question but that anti-communism is a factor in much of the media presentations in this country, just as it is a factor in other aspects of our national life. But a more significant question perhaps is whether it is a value in our society, or at least perceived as a value. Herbert Gans, who has written extensively on this subject of choosing the news, discusses values at some length, and I quote briefly from him. He said, "Journalists try hard to be objective, but neither they nor anyone else can in the end proceed without values. Furthermore, reality judgments are never altogether divorced from values. The values in the news, though, are rarely explicit and must be found between the lines in what actors and activities are reported or ignored and how they are described." And he gives a list of what he sees as some of the enduring values in the news of the past several decades, which includes ethnocentrism, altruistic democracy, responsible capitalism, small-town pastoralism, individualism, moderatism, social order, and national leadership. And on the question of responsible capitalism as a value, he says, American news is, of course, consistently critical of communist and democratic socialist economies. In fact, though, foreign news is more worried about the political and cultural shortcomings of socialism or communism. To be sure, both are considered suspect because public ownership and other socialist programs will do away with private property and impair productivity and growth. But descriptions of existing income distributions in America and elsewhere now regularly imply that economic inequality is undesirable, even if they also imply that income redistribution is not the right solution. Still, he says the primary dangers of socialism are cultural homogeneity, erosion of political liberties, and the burgeoning of bureaucracy. He also points out that although domestic politicians who criticize governmental welfare measures as socialistic or communistic no longer get quite the attention they once did, domestic news continues to remain critical even of American socialism. More correctly, he says the news ignores it, for socialist critiques of the American economy as well as the activities of America's socialist parties and informal groups are not considered newsworthy. And perhaps we could start with that. Do the media ignore socialist critiques of the American economy? Only because the AP is not here to start it off, I will ask Karl Meyer of the New York Times if he could comment on that.
Oh, could I wave on that? Turn to someone else.
Sure. Who would... I was going to ask Alex to respond to you, but let Alex start. Do the American mainstream media ignore socialist criticisms of our economy?
Yeah, of course they do. Yeah. Oh, God, this thing is anchored. Can we pull it up? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, of course they ignore them. I think the thing is all a bit simpler than sometimes people make it out. Communism, as perceived by people who run papers, really means taking their property away. I mean, what could be simpler than that? I'd read just setting the agenda. It's all summed up, really, in a rather simple, not from my prose. You think I'm going to read out something I wrote? I'm not. Averell Harriman, the late Averell Harriman, unquestioned member of the elite running this country for a very long time. During the war, Newsweek began to criticize the efficiency of daylight bombing of Germany, asking, in fact, whether this terror bombing of the population was doing much good. And Robert Lovett, who was at the State Department, asked Harriman to do something about this. Now, Harriman had invested in Newsweek, and he wrote to his brother Roland, who was on the board of directors. And he said, "Tell Roland that I'm in dead earnest and will brook no compromise. I have not supported Newsweek for 10 years through its grave difficulties to allow our hired men to use the magazine to express their narrow, uninformed, or insidious ideas. Roland has my full authority to use any strong-arm measures he considers necessary. The other directors can be asked to resign if they do not go along." Now, you should really have that nailed up over the door of every newspaper, because when you say to people, how do these stories come about? People say, well, it's something that fell through the cracks, How is it that such and such a thing didn't get reported? Oh, I don't know, there was a decision, which we can't really find out. It all seems to be very mysterious. But the essential facts are simple, that newspapers, television stations, radio stations, publishing companies in this country are owned by private capital. The boss, the owners, have a clear idea of their status and function. They wish to go on enjoying the happy state which has brought them to the usually immense wealth that they enjoy. And they wish to keep it that way. Now, the thing about communism is that it may be this and it may be that, but everybody clearly understands that it probably means taking money away from rich people. That's the absolute... That really is the nitty-gritty of the situation. The rich man might become a poor man, and the rich person has the right, like everybody else, to defend themselves. So when you say, now let's get down to the question you asked, I'm not going to go on too long. Like, do they report critiques of US society? Well, the other night, watching the election returns, there was Tom Brokaw. I think it was Tom Brokaw, a completely free and independent journalist. It's true that occasionally the programmers you watch, they were featuring commercials from General Electric, which of course owns NBC. And one wondered how many times Mr. Brokaw would ever actually feature long, penetrating and critical investigation of the products which his subsidiary part of GE was presenting during the election process. And anyway, at one point he said to Arbatov, from the US-Canadian Institute in the Soviet Union in Moscow, he said, when you look at this, something like this, he said, when you look at this extraordinary process, this democratic thing going on here, will the day ever come when, you'll have this kind of thing in your country? And Arbatov said, well, I'm not sure we want to, really. This grotesque overuse of money, incredible vulgarization of issues, visible corruption, incredibly stupid things being said week after week, month after month. I'm not sure we want it. So they sort of hauled off Arbatov, and then Brokaw turned to Chancellor, who'd earlier defined himself as a man of the extreme middle, and he sort of said, you know those Russians, notice how they always turn the question back on you. So obviously the answer to your question is no. The critiques of capitalist society as made by socialist countries don't appear in the capitalist press.
Well, that was certainly better than a one-word answer we were all expecting. Bill Tatum, would you like to tell us, as the only publisher and media owner here, albeit not what most people would classify as the establishment media, what about the Amsterdam News? Do you will be extremely critical of the Reagan administration policy in Africa, for example. Will you be critical of the economic policies?
Absolutely. Alex, in reference to you first. Read my lips. In defense of those who decided at one time in their lives to become publishers, I have you recall a line that I'll paraphrase for you. Freedom of the press belongs to he who owns one. Now, I have got to describe to you, and this is important in terms of a backdrop here. I had freelanced for the National Guardian, and then I'd gone to Sweden to write for Stockholm's Tidning and to do a column there and to do some general assignments for that social democratic newspaper. I could not get a job in the United States at the, quote, regular press during those years. And black newspapers, the Amsterdam News in particular, was trying to absorb all those blacks who wished to be writers. I couldn't get a job there either. I became a freelancer, and then I went to Europe to work in Denmark and in Sweden and in Norway and wrote anywhere in the world that I could. When I came back to America, I discovered I still couldn't get a job doing what I wanted to do. And then as a freelancer, I got an assignment. And that assignment had something to do with something I don't even remember. But when I turned the assignment in, I was to get $150 for it, and I needed to pay my rent. And the editor said it was a marvelous piece, except it wasn't what he wanted it to say. And he said I had to change it. And I insisted that I was not going to change it. Give me my money. He said, no money. You change it. Well, I'd just gotten back. I had no money. And finally, I wound up crying and changing it in order to pay the rent. That was the day I decided that I was going to own my own newspaper. Now, there is a standing order at my newspaper that when I write anything from anywhere in the world, that not one line is to be changed without my approval, even if it's wrong. I say that for a very simple reason. In terms of anti-communism and those in America who happen to be black, who have never really felt that they were a real part of any communist or real left-wing movement, I'm saddened by that fact, because as I recall my days at Camp Unity and sitting around a campfire singing Joe Hill, remember it? I dreamed I saw Joe Hill last night, alive as you and me. Says I to Joe, you're 10 years dead. I never died, said he. I never died, said he. In the last 15 or 20 years, Joe Hill has died. And I hope that a conference such as this might bring back the spirit that we once had in America, that Joe Hill lives.
Thank you. While we've raised the question of racism, let me bring a further point on that and see if some other of our panelists can comment. Astonishingly, or perhaps not astonishing to those people in the industry, more than half of the 1,700 some odd daily newspapers in the United States have never employed, ever, a single black or Latino or Asian American journalist. And although minorities make up 20% of the population or more, only about 5.7% of all working professional journalists come from minority groups, and the large majority of those work for minority-owned papers and radio stations. according to the latest figures, there are only about 24 black editorial board writers in the entire United States. And it certainly has been suggested that this disparity leads to more racist news coverage in issues like crime reporting, where one could argue we are led to believe that almost every crime victim is white and almost every crime perpetrator is black, in covering the homeless, and in cases like Howard Beach and Bernard Goetz, and most recently in the reporting on the Jackson campaign. There is certainly strong arguments being made in progressive communities that the white press coverage of the Jackson campaign was racist. And I'd like to ask our panelists if they think the Jesse Jackson campaign was covered fairly, and if not, why not? And perhaps someone on this side would start.
Is this on yet?
Is it? If it's not on, ask them to pass that mic down. Oh, wait, magic. Joanne Ball.
Give it time.
Should we use the other one for now, or?
For somebody.
Want to try that?
30 seconds, you said.
Simply won't reach.
Waiting for the other shoe to drop.
Give it a tap. See if it's... Oh, there we go.
All right. There you go.
Hello, hello. Okay. One of the things that was talked about a lot during the 2 years that the campaign was going on and that the year that Jesse Jackson was an official candidate was that his candidacy for the most part was treated like a curiosity. And that is mainly a kind of continuation of how a lot of black Americans are treated in this country, particularly educated, middle-class black Americans. And the question that was always raised, and then it stopped being raised around after Michigan, was what does Jesse want? As though he wanted something different from anyone else who was running for president. And if anything, the campaign that he ran did was to open a lot of doors, not just for other politicians who were trying to carry on and go onto his coattails, but it opened doors for black reporters who had not ever had the opportunity to cover a national campaign. For a while, I was one of those who was on the bus and got to go to Iowa and got to go to New Hampshire, did some reporting here in Massachusetts such that the campaign was here. And it was always amazing to me how the stories were played in comparison to what we saw out there in the field. And a lot of times, things that we thought were most important that Jackson had said or that had happened just got barely a mention. And I know that that is true in general, but it had a way of making us realize that there is a certain stratification of what is covered in when it comes to race, and that those things that he would say or that would come out as quote-unquote black issues may not have been treated as seriously as black reporters thought they should have been, or treated in a way that was part of the mainstream news. It would be shunted off to a side sometimes. And those are things that you constantly guard yourself against if you're a black reporter, making sure that you're not being asked to cover something because you are a black reporter. Or if you are, that you bring something to that you know for a fact you will make better because of your race. And it's a tricky business, but I think that when the day ever comes that newsrooms do have a greater representation of all races and more women, that we will not fall into the problems of second-guessing ourselves as much and wondering how things would be viewed and whether they will be viewed with the same kind of seriousness as if a white reporter wrote it, or if it would be placed in the same place as a story written by another reporter.
Terry, you want to comment on that? Do you think was the Washington Post, and I'm not holding you responsible for the Post, but was it by and large fair to Jesse, do you think?
Well, I would rather respond to something else Joanne said that I think is relevant in terms of anti-communism, which I don't think was too much a factor in the Jesse Jackson campaign. But in coverage of Latin America, I think a lot of the problems Joanne mentioned also occur. The fact that the reporters on the scene may have a much better sense of how people feel where they are and what the important issues are. And when the information filters back to the desk, in my case in Washington, it is not taken seriously. It's minimized. There are a lot of reasons for that. Partly it's the cultural training, education, and preparation of the journalists. Those who have lived and worked in foreign countries tend to be much more sensitive and aware of the concerns of people in the third world countries, the concerns that we heard this afternoon and the point of view we heard this afternoon. Not totally sympathetic by any means, but more sympathetic than the people in Washington. But when the news gets back to Washington, there's a lot of competition among different sections of the newspaper to get stories on the front page. We have what's called a news conference every afternoon with the top editors of the Post, and the editors of the National, the Foreign, the Metro, and the Style sections meet with Ben Bradley and Len Downey, the executive and managing editors, and compete to get their stories on the front page. And it's very much a sort of macho, playing hardball kind of thing. And there's a lot of competition to present the stories as hard-hitting, tough news stories. And my experience has been that stories that express what I see as perhaps concern and sympathy for certain third world issues are not considered the right kind of news stories to go on the front page. And reporters, after a while, become discouraged because they need for their stories to be on the front page to advance their careers. An example from my undistinguished career at the Washington Post was when I was in Nicaragua for the 6th anniversary of the revolution. I thought it would be a great idea to write a story about one low-level Sandinista activist or militant who worked out in the countryside and just try to tell the story in his own words, how he became involved in the revolution, what he expected the revolution to do for him and the people of his town. And so I wrote it up and sent it into the Outlook section, which is the Sunday section, which publishes sort of opinion and analytical pieces. And it was sent back to me, and I was told that it was too much of an ode to the Sandinistas. The implication being that it was too naive, and that I was perhaps being used and manipulated by the Sandinistas, that I was not critical enough. So I think it's part of that mindset. There's more to it than that, the anti-communist bias in the media and in all of American society. But I think that's part of it, the competition to have a hard-hitting story.
Thank you. Alex, you said I should point out that Bill Styron asked to join this panel as a reader rather than a writer, and as someone who studies the newspaper, we can't blame him for anything that appears in the newspapers. But were you gesturing? Would you like to comment on this question?
Well, I don't really.
Hold the mic over.
What question you mean specifically?
I'm sorry, I thought you gestured to me that you wanted to respond.
No, I'd rather save my...
Let me ask Carl the first question. Carl Myers, do you think the major papers were, on the whole, fair to Jesse Jackson or fair to his campaign or whatever?
So I want to answer it my own way, and I'm going to take it around. The first, I want to say something very important, that I owe my presence here to one of the worst pieces of legislation in Congress ever passed, the McCarran Act. And the reason this is so is that back in 1962, I got a call from a Polish journalist in New York, and he said that an Italian friend of his, one Gianfranco Corsini, had been admitted to the United States to cover the United Nations. But since he was a communist, he couldn't leave New York City. He couldn't leave, in fact, Manhattan Island, unless he had the name of someone that he could name as a host or visit. And would I serve? I said, on one condition, I'd be delighted that we have lunch. Not knowing what to expect, Corsini came to Washington, and I found this delightful, charming, sophisticated Italian who spoke better English than I did, and who explained to me some of the complicated dimensions of Italian communism about which I knew little. And then he said to me, he said, do you think I could talk to someone in the White House, Arthur Schlesinger? So I called up Schlesinger, and I said I have in my office the foreign editor of Paese Sera, who would like to meet with you. And Schlesinger said, well, on 3 conditions. First, off the record. Second, not in the White House. Third, you be along as a witness. So I was there as a witness when my friend Corsini said to Schlesinger, said that I'm really here to tell you that you may find this hard to believe, but there are people in the Italian communists that want John Kennedy to succeed and are sympathetic to many of the things that he's trying to do. And this led to a very interesting exchange. Now, years passed. I maintained this wonderful friendship with my friend Louis, as his nickname as he's known to his friends. And the other day he called me up and he said, there's this conference going on in Cambridge. I said, I'd be delighted. So that on this ton of iniquity that this dreadful act has caused, one mitigating little feather is on the other side, that this mysterious process has worked out where I am again with my good friend Corsini. Now, having said something about background, I really wanted to talk about the premises of a lot of the discussion, and to, in the spirit that Mr. Zinn said of presenting other points of view and other ideas, to challenge some of the premises of what we're saying. I think that the premise in the whole title of the panel of who manages the agenda is that, first of all, that there's some kind of management, that there is an invisible hand or a visible hand. And number 2, that the management of the agenda is what fundamentally conditions people's attitudes to the Soviet Union and communism. Now, there's a lot of truth. There is management. What the way papers handle it obviously affects it. But I want to say that I think that the tendency is often excessively exaggerated, that it's a view held from many quarters. Vice President Agnew had the same view, that a secret conspiracy existed to foist on the people a liberal agenda. And David Halberstam, in his book, The Powers That Be, the very title of the book, proclaims the idea that there's this power that can decide elections, that can switch the fate of nations. I think that there's a large part of illusion in this, that it's, I think, interesting that the greatest of all movies that I've seen, Citizen Kane, is about a publisher who went mad because he believed that press power could be translated into political power. That Citizen Kane, Orson Welles, was an extreme statement of a common tendency among proprietors. I would like Mr. Tatum maybe to take up this point.
Oh, I sure will.
Now, let me put the opposite considerations. Consideration number 1, that it's not the messenger but the message that really matters. that Franklin Roosevelt was opposed overwhelmingly in almost every election, and certainly in his last 3 elections, by the American editorial writers and the press. Yet it didn't make any difference, because he came on radio and was able to take his message directly to an audience that overrode whatever the newspapers may have said, the columnists may have said. Now, to take more narrowly the question of communism. It's certainly true that there's an anti-communist bias. It's ludicrous to deny it. I'm sure there is. But let me put you an interesting thing. At the time of the Iowa caucus, when Mikhail Gorbachev was in Washington, it was said to Mr. Gorbachev, you know, we've taken polls and we found that you're more popular than any Democrat who's running in Iowa. I was just in Germany, and I was told in Germany that the most popular political figure in Germany is now Mikhail Gorbachev. So much so that 2 weeks ago, Chancellor Kohl, a Christian Democrat, was in Moscow, obviously trying to translate and use some of the magnetism that Gorbachev has for all Europeans to his own personal benefit. Now, why is it that Gorbachev has this popularity? Well, this morning I had the good fortune to see Andrei Sakharov, who was here for the first time, and who, a few years ago, it seemed an impossible idea that he'd ever even leave the Soviet Union. He was a prisoner in Gorky. He was watched day and night. He was there 6 years. He had to go on hunger strikes to get his wife to get medical treatment outside of the Soviet Union. When Mikhail Gorbachev had a telephone installed in the house that Sakharov was living in Gorky, and one phone call came. The very next day, there was a phone call installed, and the next day, a phone call came saying, Andrei, Dr. Sakharov, or Andrei, I forget the diminutive in it, this is Mikhail Gorbachev. We would like you to come back to Moscow to resume your work. That single gesture, that unconditional release of a man who was kept under house arrest for cruelly, a man whose crime was to speak out for human rights, to speak out for a freer, more democratic system, I think did probably more than any other single gesture that Gorbachev in his 3 or 4 years in office has carried out. But that changed the attitude. Combine that with the fact that he's had a series of policy changes in the Soviet Union that are interesting and attractive to a lot of people. That he's been able to make a vigorous case for himself directly on American television, which is more important than a lot of the stuff, a lot of the garbage that gets published that reflects a kind of ignorant, stupid, forthright, superstition-ridden anti-communism. So that in the case, let's say, to come back to Jesse Jackson, if the press was exquisitely fair, I don't think that would, that's not the consideration. It's not in the power of the press to nominate Jesse Jackson, and I'm pleased to have an unpopular view on this.
Let me ask Alex to respond to that, and then
Sure.
Well, I think Carl's allocution sort of illustrated something I tried to say at the very beginning, which is when you press people on, has the press got power? Do the owners have power? The propositions vanish into, with all due respect, on a kind of verbal fog. You suddenly find, is it a conspiracy? Does it really have any influence? Other things have influence. Of course other things have influence. Of course the deeds of politicians have influence. But if I think Carl really believed what he's saying about the relative lack of influence, then I don't know why he's spending his time writing editorials for the New York Times.
It's a living.
It's a living. But there are other things, street sweeping, things like that. But
for the same reason that you scribble in The Nation, Alex.
Yeah, but I think your function is a serious one. I'm taking your function.
Well, yours is a serious one too.
We can discuss the relative seriousness of The Nation and The New York Times behind closed doors. But the point I'm making is this. When my father joined the London Times, he said he had an uncle who was a high up at the Times. He said, "Who sets the policy of the Times?" And the uncle said, "Policy of the Times is set by a committee that never meets." By which I think he meant, the collective opinion of the ruling class, not to put too fine a point on it. Now, to go directly to, for the last few years, Carl has been writing editorials about Central and Latin America. Now, these have been very important. Now, I would submit that it would be very unlikely at any point, whether he or anyone else on the editorial board wrote them, that you'd suddenly find an editorial saying that in many ways aspects of the Sandinista experience have been an unqualified success, and that programs of literacy, education, and the rest of it were really very, very good, and the principles of private ownership perhaps might be thrown into question. In fact, Chomsky, I think, once did an analysis of editorials and columns on the editorial pages and op-ed pages of the Washington Post and the New York Times over a period of, I think, 3 months. As I recall it, there were 81 columns and editorials, and I think not one had any recognition of any positive achievement by the Sandinistas. Now, to go to Jackson, so I think this is an important part of agenda setting. The Times editorial pages are read by the people who run the networks. They're actually willy-nilly read by people running papers around the country. I think, very unfortunately, the editorial pages and the front pages of the Washington Post and the New York Times have an absurd overweight in the setting of the terms of national discourse. It's what people in Washington, particularly with the Post, turn to. They look, what is the order of business? Unfortunately, because there is some mad idea, which I think has receded, that somehow these papers are part of the, perhaps stemming from the days of Spiro Agnew, who is, of course, an ignoramus, whose speeches were written in large part by a columnist now working for the New York Times, Bill Safan, who was put there by the proprietor, I think, during Watergate, to say, let's not go too far here. The agenda is set by these papers, which actually, if you read a number of papers across the country, are far more conservative in editorial position than many papers in the Midwest and the West. So there's this matter of agenda setting, in which I think editorial opinion is extremely important, and I think the editorial opinion, as written by people like Carl, reflects the limits of what they think they can get away with in the prevailing political situation in the New York Times and the Washington Post, whose owners, Katharine Graham and the Sulzberger family, are not known to be communists. They're just not. Let's go to Jackson. Now, Jackson was obviously treated with tremendous racism by the press. There's absolutely no question of that. I might remind you of the headline in the New York Times when Jackson won Louisiana in the primary in 1984, the first by any black in any state presidential primary contest in the history of the United States. First time in the nation's history. The headline was, Jackson takes Louisiana vote in low turnout. I don't think you saw Bush wins presidency in low turnout. Now, why was Jackson under such attack by the press? I think it's beyond contest that he was under a tremendously harsh, unfair attack, and his achievements, if you look at the headlines around Super Tuesday particularly, ignored when his political achievements should not have been ignored. And I think actually the reason is in part racism and in part reverts to our old friend anti-communism. Because Jackson is not only a black person, he's a relatively radical person. And the number of times I've read columnists, white columnists and pundits saying if only Representative William Gray of Pennsylvania was running, a responsible black, how great it would be. Well, he wasn't. Jackson was running. And what did Jackson do? Jackson went to he went to Cuba. He went to Nicaragua. Worse still, he went and shook hands with Yasser Arafat, kissed him on both cheeks. A fatal mistake. And that's why Jackson got wasted, because he represented a seriously radical force in American politics, which he still does. And if you read the papers today, tomorrow, and yesterday, you will see already the warning shots from editorial opinion that once again Jackson is trying to lead the Democratic Party down a thoroughly unappetizing path.
Let me ask Mr. Corsini, as the only non-American journalist here and having some ability to look at the American press as an outsider, although you've spent a lot of time in the United States, what did you think about the coverage of the election campaign, and in particular the way the Jackson campaign was treated?
Well, first of all, I want to thank my friend Carl for the things that he said about me, about us, and obviously if we've been friends for over 25 years, we must have something in common, although I'm a member of the Communist Party and he is not. And I'm glad that he raised the question, because strangely enough, when I was introduced as an Italian correspondent, no mention was made of the fact that I am now the special correspondent of the Communist Party national newspaper of Italy. So I am, I guess, the only living communist around this table.
Card carrier.
And I'm glad about this. I'm glad that it's been known, because maybe at the end of what I say, some people might have thought that I was some kind of an infiltrator, who was trying to disrupt the meeting. What I meant to say is this, that I do agree very much with the general premises that Karl Mayer made, and my friends know how I feel about it, because I have been writing about these problems for 30 years. I am not any longer secluded. I've done regular reporting on Italian politics for the Nation and others, and so I would say that on the whole things have changed and are changing, so much so that we are sitting here and discussing about the problem of anti-communism. But when it comes to the question of the press and, as they say, the media, because the printed press is only one part now of a bigger, information setup, I have difficulty in following the so-called conspiracy theory that has been developed through the years by many American students and also European students of the media, of the nature and the influence of the media. I can tell you that I can make some observations from the point of view of a European who has to write about this country, who is very interested in this country, and therefore has to make a very large use of the American media, all of them, of the type of information that can get in this country in order to have data, in order to inform itself, in order to understand what's going on. And when I hear about the conspiracy that is going on in this country, I'm wondering, what people believe is happening in Europe. Let's talk about Western Europe now, the Western world. What people think there is a certain innuendo that things are going better in Europe than they're going in the United States. But I think the Italian example could be of interest, probably, because Italy is the only Western country where you have a very large Communist Party which represents 1/3 of the population, more or less, the popular vote, and in parliament, 1/3 of the Italian parliament. It's a democratic country with a very democratic, progressive constitution that was approved after the war. And we have a free press. But at the same time, television is a government property. Television is run by the government, is owned by the government. It's the equivalent of what you call public television, but only in the sense that it is the government that through a special committee, controls, checks, makes the appointments, and so forth. Therefore, we can say that in Italy, the conspiracy is very clear. The government owns television, sets the rules, and whatever we hear on the air, has to be filtered through the power of the political parties that are included and are part of the government. Each one of them has the two major of them has taken possession of one of the channels, and when we have elections, the news are made by the political parties who run the government. And what about the opposition? Of course, the Communist Party represents 1/3 of the country, has access, limited access to television, has the possibility of publishing his own papers if there is the money for that, and it has an important national newspaper. But what about all the rest? The Italian press, which is not the expression of big corporations, or big conglomerates, is the expression of several political parties that directly or indirectly own this press, and also are the parties that have been running Italy for over 40 years. When I come to the States, and this is the point I want to make, for the first time I have the feeling, the healthy feeling, the pleasant feeling, maybe naive feeling, for the first time of having access to a very wide range of opinions, information, publications that would be unthinkable in Italy, in our Italian system. Just to stick to the example that has been made, what, like me, all the other foreign correspondents are using the American press and the media in order to gather information and to interpret or to inform about what's going on in the United States. Now, as far as Jackson is concerned, I think that the enormous coverage that Jackson has had in Europe during the primaries, I have written 2 editorials on Jackson in my newspaper, about primaries, which should be a very American affair of little concern for a country so far away like Italy. But the great interest that there has been in Europe has been the consequence of the fact that the European correspondents in the United States were bombarded by an amount of information, whether it is biased or non-biased, but so rich, so detailed, so intense about the Jackson campaign that they couldn't refrain from reporting. This is only to say that apart from the biases that are typical in our Western society of any kind, of any type of information, the quantity, the amount of information that is distributed to the public through the American media, the mere quantity, I think is in itself something that should not be underestimated, because through this quantity, a lot of people, whether they are foreigners or Americans, can filter a lot of details of ideas that, in my opinion, are denied to many of the European audiences by a press that is much more limited in scope and, I would say, in curiosity.
Let me pick up on one point you made about the fact that there is a great deal of quantity of information in this country, and there's no question many of us think there's almost an information overload in this country. The quality of that information, however, is sometimes suspect, and it may be one thing to say there were 1,000 stories about a particular aspect of the Jackson campaign, but if every one of them told the same lie, the fact that there were 1,000 doesn't make it any better. I want to pose a question for discussion and bring up something that I know that Bill Styron knows something about. I want to ask him about, and that's the question of double standards, or what I might call a dichotomy in thresholds of belief. I think, for example, that a good case can be made that most of the press in this country are willing to believe, or at least to accept as a working assumption, almost anything being done by the Soviets that they would never accept without many levels of proof on the part of an ally or an American. The Bulgarian connection being a prime example, where it was perfectly reasonable to assume as your starting premise that the Soviet Union would try to assassinate the Pope. And I wonder whether that's because of some form of anti-communism. Are we conditioned to assume that communists might be perfectly willing to murder a Pope, but that non-communists wouldn't be quite willing to do it? I also think there's a very different level of treatment in, for example, the allegations of chemical warfare being used by the Cambodians and the Vietnamese, as opposed to the same allegations against the Iraqis. I think, indeed, the evidence is pretty clear now that in the case of the Cambodians it was untrue, and in the case of the Iraqis it was true, and the press gave you the opposite impression. That leads me to...
Can I challenge practically everything you said?
You can, but I want to finish my thing, call on Bill Styron, and then I'll call on you. And I hope I have some friends in the audience that can deal with that during the questions. I want to ask if, I know there's one. I was going to say, does anyone on the panel dispute? I will change. Does anyone except Carl on the panel dispute that the media coverage of elections in El Salvador, for example, differed from the coverage of elections in Nicaragua? I know Bill Styron was in Nicaragua and covered some of the peace treaty negotiations. I want to ask him what he thought about the coverage of those negotiations.
Well, first I'd like to preface whatever I say by the fact by saying that I'm the only member of this panel who is not a journalist, although I've written journalism, I feel a little out of my depth because it's not my preoccupation as it is with the ladies and gentlemen here. I respect journalism very much. I think it's plays a very important function in our society. But I did want to make that caveat in that I'm not an expert on the nuts and bolts of journalism. I did, however, find myself in a situation of profound moral indignation the summer before last during the Iran-Contra hearings, when I suppose that I was in the Marines in both World War II and the Korean War as an officer and enlisted man. And they say once a Marine, always a Marine, which is unfortunately a truism that we ex-Marines have to bear. I saw Oliver North as a man who had betrayed almost everything, it seems to me, that the Marine Corps had ever stood for. As a result, I immediately got in touch with a good friend of mine, the distinguished Mexican novelist Carlos Fuentes, who gave a magnificent commencement address here a number of years ago, and said we had to go to Nicaragua, and we did. I wish that the spirit of Joe Hill that Mr. Tatum had just mentioned had been part of our own spirit as country. I'm appalled at the fact that most writers and intellectuals have viewed that wretched little war in Nicaragua with such equanimity. To me, it's been a disgrace that there has not been more outrage expressed. But at any rate, I determined to go down there. I went with Carlos with the full knowledge that when I came away, the reportage in the newspapers, and I'm speaking specifically of the New York Times, which is, I suppose I read like Russians read Pravda, because it's the only newspaper that I can lay hands on in my little country town in Connecticut, except for USA Today. And I was astounded. Fuentes and I were indeed the guests of the Sandinistas, about whom I have reservations, but far less reservations than I do about Ronald Reagan and his monstrous aggression. We were there for 8 or 9 days, and we were privileged, just by historical chance, to go to the meeting in San Jose of the Central American presidents to ratify the Arias peace plan. It was an extraordinary, as I say, fortuitous, accidental sort of thing, because we hadn't planned it that way. But we went along with President Ortega, who at dinner the night before the meeting in San Jose rather nervously told us that the plane which was going to take us to San Jose had been canceled because a red-eye missile had been spotted by the intelligence, and so we went by bus, which gave us all a great bit of a relief. The meeting itself was extraordinary, and Fuentes and I were like flies on the wall. We were there when this amazing delegation of U.S. congressmen, led fortunately by the estimable Lee Hamilton, confronted Ortega and presented him with the news that he'd better shape up or else. It was an interesting confrontation. It was done very politely. And as it turned out, as you all know, the Arias peace plan was ratified. When we got back to the United States, I was astounded by the reporting, largely that of James Lemoyne, who I could only say was a liar. I do not have a sheaf of the articles written by Lemoyne to corroborate this statement I just made, but I can assure you, virtually everything Lemoyne said about the peace process and the subsequent events was at variance with what Fuentes and I observed. I might add, just in passing, that La Prensa, which was, of course, banned for a while, the ban was released the day after we got back to Managua, and it described the meal that Fuentes and I presumably were given by Daniel Ortega and his wife, and I quote, translated from the Spanish, crab meat casserole au gratin, squab with morel sauce, apple blinis with prunes, which is not at all like the tamales and beans that we were actually fed, but this is what La Prensa feels is their version of the truth. In short, I do want to interject one other comment. I totally, without knowing that Mr. Meyer would be sitting to my left, I brought from my house in Connecticut a New York Times editorial, which, it might surprise you, is to my mind a very sound and very judicious editorial called Reagan's Contra War, Reagan's Failure. It was written, Mr. Meyer told me just now, by himself, and I think it's well balanced, but the point is this. How do we deal with a press, with a monolithic newspaper like the New York Times, which demonstrates such incredible schizophrenia? This seems to me one of the matters which we have not addressed, and I'd like to see it taken further.
Thank you. Bill Tatum has been waiting to respond for some time. Let me ask you to use the mic, and then I'll call on Carl.
Mr. Styron, you attacked the New York Times. You attack it. Just recently, in the matter of Tawana Brawley, there was a critique of media by Fred Friendly and an esteemed panel of journalists on the public broadcasting system. It was very much like this panel trying to determine how media had responded to the Tawana Brawley story. As all of you know, someone gave information from the grand jury to the New York Times 2 or 3 days prior to the release date of the grand jury report. It was said that the grand jury report was not then complete. Yet, after a long story in the New York Times, I think covered 2 full pages, or 1.5 full pages, without a byline, but a box of people who contributed to the story without telling when, produced a story the following day, an editorial rather, the lead editorial, that said, before the grand jury report, mind you, that Tawana Brawley is a liar and Mason, Maddox, Sharpton are charlatans. I attacked the New York Times for rushing to judgment because the Tawana Brawley story is not yet over. And then something very curious happened. I got a letter from a black reporter at the New York Times who'd worked there for 11 years, describing in some detail what had happened at the New York Times in terms of the Tawana Brawley story. And I was saddened because for any journalist who ever believed anything about the press, the New York Times is sort of like a Bible until you really get to understand, by traveling throughout the world, the different kinds of spins that get put on different kinds of stories. And I'm not really attacking the New York Times, I'm attacking power and the abuse of power by those who have it. Jesse Jackson, anyone who can sit and say that the reporting, the unfairness of the reporting, or that the reporting on Jesse Jackson from 84 on was not one of the most biased, I tell you, moments in American journalistic history is either the biggest liar in the world or the biggest fool. I've spent a lot of time with Jesse Jackson, and I know Jesse Jackson well. And to ride from one place to another in a car with only 1 or 2 people in it and to listen to him describe his version of a story that appeared, or to be with Jesse reporting a story that somebody else is reporting, is to make you sick of your profession. But let me go one step further here. I want to share with you something, if you will allow a moment. Today's edition of the Amsterdam News has an editorial about Jesse and the very thing, and a very short one, the very thing we talked about earlier. And it says, in part, this is the first day of the rest of Jesse Jackson's political life. And so it is for ours as well. The last months of this presidential campaign have been very difficult for us. We gave our loyalty and our votes, as did Jesse, to an ungrateful candidate, as well as to a group of wimps running the Democratic National Committee who abused us with their hypocrisy and insulted us with their indifference. That alone would not have been too difficult to swallow. We have weathered hard times before, even from those who told us that they were our friends. But this time it was different. Out of Boston, from the heart of the Dukakis camp, came an attitude of such arrogance as to leave those who chose to be a member of the wedding shaken by the incompetence and contempt for those who were black who truly wished to serve. And the insults to and hostility for Jesse were unbearable. Yet, Jesse as we stayed the course and kept the faith. Jesse is the heir to what is left of the Democratic Party. There are others who will lay claim to it, but it is his to shape into that bastion of liberalism that the leaders of the Democratic Party tried to deny. This denial brought the party and its standard bearers to their knees. They pretended, too, that the black press did not exist, and in so doing negated the most direct and trusted route to blacks in America. Jesse can, in fact, take the party almost anywhere he wants to go, and we are prepared to go with him. But this time, there must be something in it for us, like a better life in America for those who do the work and a fair share of the economic pie. The next presidential campaign has already begun, and we must remember to keep hope alive. Try reading the black press sometimes, you'll understand what the other press is talking about.
I'm glad to see that Bill Tatum has decided to branch out. Many of you may not know, but for about 2 years he's written an editorial every single week in the Amsterdam News called Mayor Koch Must Resign. It saves... I think it saves him a little money in typesetting costs because it's the same title for the editorial every single week.
This week is the 140th edition, and USA Today called me saying they were going to run a story on it, because when I started, 86% of the black people in New York City responded favorably to Edward I. Koch. In the last poll, I think it was the Marist poll, though I'm not sure, 84% of the black people do not respond favorably. They now understand.
I want to ask Carl to respond to some of the points that I know he wants to respond to. I would also like someone from the program committee, if they could come up and slip me a note and let me know what our time in this room is, because I want to start taking some questions from the audience momentarily. And could someone bring us up some water, please? Carl.
Thank you. I really think that the last comments illustrate the very point that I want to make. I want to start with talking first to my friend Alec Coburn, who told this good story about his father being on the Times, and then he spoke of the influence that the editorials in my newspaper and in the Washington Post have. And I agree with it. I mean, I will say something about that. But the assumption in what Alex said was that these were the sole sources of information that people get. And it seems to me that the overwhelming and triumphant, and listen to me before you start hissing, the overwhelming and triumphant point is that there's a multiplicity of sources that people get information from. Otherwise, how, if the story in Nicaragua has been so badly told, do you explain the fact that opinion polls over and again show that there is no support in the United States for the Contras?
Hold it. Wait, let Carl finish. Hold on. Let's let him finish and have his say. We're going to have questions from the audience, and I know Alex wants to respond, although first let me ask Carl.
Yeah, well, so if I may press on. Years ago, I talked to a Soviet journalist, and I asked him what paper he regarded as the equivalent of Pravda, and he said then it was Time magazine, which I thought was a rather shrewd remark, because this was in the height of the loose era. I would say that now, that the equivalent, at least rhetorically, is the Wall Street Journal. That no newspaper, at least editorially, has taken such a sharply angled ideological spin. One thing in particular I'd like to mention. The Wall Street Journal, more than any other paper in the United States, ringingly took up the case that the Soviet Union was using chemical warfare in Indochina, and that yellow rain was the result of this. I'm pleased to say that a colleague of mine on the Times wrote a series of editorials taking up the case of Professor Nesselson, here, Nesselson, that's what I said, at MIT, who consistently and rationally exposed the shortcomings in the official version. Now, in the end, people did have access to other views, even in what I would call the closest thing to Pravda. That if you look on the op-ed side of the Wall Street Journal, you will find at least once every week or so my colleague Alec Coburn. You will also find a number of stories whose premises and whose information go contrary to the editorial predilections of the Wall Street Journal. This, I submit, is one of the strengths of a very muddled press system that we have, that there is such a variety, such as you quite rightly said, an overkill of information, that you can find out in the interstices of this system many things about that feed into the net impression that we have about our politics. To take up the point about the Times' coverage. It's certainly true, and I'm not going to get into a detailed discussion of I'm not in the news part of the paper, of whether this story was bad or this story was good. But what is certainly also true is no paper is subject to such relentless scrutiny by so many critics from the left and the right that when the coverage came up on the Tawana Brawley case, the reporter did write the letter to the Amsterdam News. You published the letter. What happened to that reporter? Is the reporter still at the New York Times?
I talked to him night before last, and he's still there.
Okay. The Washington Post ran a story repeating all the criticisms, correct? Other media took up this case, went into the whole analysis of it, that despite your feeling that there's an arrogance here, would you agree?
You're talking to Alex Avina.
To you.
Okay, go ahead.
That the coverage in the Brawley case has been examined and argued about in other publications, and that this is by no means something that is just a one side has been presented on it.
Respond to
Sure.
You know, the problem with what you're saying is what you are stuck with all the news that's fit to print. Now, that is believed. It was in journalism school, it was the paper that we were given, and so they said, this is the Bible. Now, I had always felt that until I got to know that sometimes the New York Times can slip and slide. And I would agree with you that the gentleman in question has not been fired, but he's a member of a pretty strong union at the time. He's also black, and the Times, EEO is a little shaky. But what I'm saying...
All right, can I take you up on that?
Yeah.
He belongs to a strong union, and he's also black. Earlier, we were told that these papers were kind of monolithic and subject to proprietors. But you've just made two interesting points there. that it isn't monolithic, that there is a union which protects people, that this is not a system where there's an arbitrary proprietor saying we're going to do this or we're going to do that.
Come on, really?
Carl,
Wait a minute.
Hey, Carl, as a publisher, I have the same union that you have.
Mm-hmm.
Remember that the New York Times, the New York Post, the Daily News, and the Amsterdam News formed Local 3 of the Newspaper Guild in 1935.
Mm-hmm.
And we go by the same rules and regulations that you go by because we have a shop there too. And let me tell you, you can send somebody to Siberia while they're sitting in your office.
Mm-hmm.
Let me cut in. I think we only have about 20 minutes or so for questions, maybe half an hour. I'll give Alex a minute or two to respond, only because you can't control yourself. And we'll go on.
Just on arbitrary power, I mean, anyone who studies the dismissal of, let's say, Sidney Schanberg from the opinion page of the New York Times, not to mention the behavior of the New York Times owner and publisher over the endorsement of Daniel Patrick Moynihan a number of years earlier, these were both unilateral decisions by the boss. But he owns it. He's got every right to do that. I mean, the thing to avoid is the hypocrisy surrounding these decisions.
What else is on your list, Alex? Keep going on the list.
Secondly,
give me some more examples.
Carl, the second point I want to come to, because I've got about 3 points and I don't want to monopolize the thing. You said, how is it that you made a contrast between the editorial opinion of the Times, or editorial opinion, and the attitude revealed by opinion polls? It's a very good point. I think when you look at the last 8 years, the editorial opinion, particularly of the New York Times and the Washington Post, and I said there was a multiplicity. I explicitly said papers across the country, many of them were much more liberal than the New York Times and the Washington Post. What that revealed, I think, was that there was a mass movement, a politics, which contrasted strongly with elite opinion. There was, it's true, 60% of the people against intervention. I happen to think, almost entirely ignored by the mainstream press, a very strong, popular left movement existed. That's the second point.
But where did they get their information?
The third point, where did they get their information? They did not get it from the New York Times. They got it from... And if you haven't, Carl, I would hope you have in your desk the rich variety of alternative opinion on Central America, which
That's precisely the point I'm making. That's what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm trying to say.
I'm trying to make the contrast between the influence on elites in this country, on the Congress, and a mass movement. There is a difference. You can't say, it's like saying, the Wall Street Journal saying, on the one hand, we have the power of the Dow Jones Company and the directors of the largest newspaper in the United States. On the other hand, to show that we are balanced, we have Alex Coburn once every 3 weeks. There's a difference.
I'm not sure I heard it right, but I think what Carl was saying is that since there are movement newspapers in the United States which tell us the truth about Nicaragua, it doesn't matter if the New York Times lies about Nicaragua. That's a little bit unfair.
That's what you call spin doctoring there. That's not at all what I said, and if you'll give me a chance, I'll restate what I want to say.
You know, I'm really appalled at the treatment that Mr. Meyer is getting from the audience and the panel. I think.
Wait a minute, come on. Let's.
I think he was very.
We're going to take questions. Let's not shout. Let's let people speak. And I'd like to let Mishra respond to this.
My objection was simply that that he has not been allowed to speak. That he has not been allowed to speak and to finish a sentence. He's trying to make some points, and I think you should at least hear him out and not distort what he said. I mean, that was a total distortion of what he said. I don't. So what?
Wait a minute.
So what? Yeah. I disagree with a lot of things other people on the panel have said, but I'm not shouting and hissing at them. There's one point I would like to make about sort of the general thesis or general premises underlying this panel, and this is really a sincere question. I'm very curious about it, and in meetings like this I always wonder about it. I'm not saying this is a way of saying we have the best media in the world or anything like that. I don't believe that, but I sort of wonder what is the ideal, the kind of a media that we want. In other countries, as Mr. Corsini pointed out, many, if not most, newspapers represent a political party or perhaps a particular group of people, and they have a very clear, well-defined point of view. Perhaps we should have an official newspaper for the Republican Party and one for the Democratic Party, and then we would know, where each newspaper stood. There'd be no question about it, no debate about it. When I lived in Nicaragua, La Prensa was a terrible newspaper and distorted everything and published all kinds of lies. But I also didn't feel the information I got from Barricada was very complete either. When I was in Moscow many years ago, long before Glasnost, I really felt starved for information. It was very hard. I felt I really did not have a complete picture of what was going on in the world. Now, it seems to me that the kind of competition between newspapers we have now that has uncovered a lot of very important information about things like Watergate and Iran-Contra is perhaps something you would want to think about before you give it up. What kind of newspapers do you want? Owned by a cooperative of journalists, perhaps? I mean, what is the ideal here? Owned by political parties? It seems very diffuse. What do people want? Well, now, who has a monopoly on truth?
Let her finish. We're going to take the question. Okay. Let me just make. Hold on, please, because we don't have floor mics, and when we have questions in a second, I'm going to have to repeat them. I want to raise one thing so Carl can respond to it. What I made my crack about. I thought, let me just pose this and see if I'm right. I thought that Alex said many Americans, a majority of Americans, in fact, as the polls show, opposed Contra aid.
That's right.
Whereupon Carl said, right, and where did they get their information? Whereupon Alex said, not from the New York Times, from the alternative press. Whereupon Carl said, that's exactly my point. Now, I want to know that's exactly what point.
No. My point is that not only is there the alternative press, there's a national public radio. There's a whole array of sources that seek out and try to do enterprising, nonconformist reporting that is a valuable source. But also in the mainstream press, you get a lot of stories, you get a lot of different views, and you get a rich diversity. I quite agree. It's that you can say, as Churchill said of democracy, that the American press system is the worst in the world. Save all the rest. And I stop right there.
Okay, let me take questions and see if people have. It's very difficult with these lights to recognize anybody near the lights. I will try to get people down here. Yes.
I'm not shouting.
Okay, don't be too long.
I think we should be entitled to a microphone too. My name is Michael Parenti, and I'm a I'm a conspiracy theorist, and I disagree with William Styron when he says that Colonel North violated everything that the Marines stood for. I believe that Colonel North stood for everything that the Marines were and did. But for more than a century, the Marines have been a force of violence and suppression throughout the world for the existing ruling interests of this country, and Colonel North did that, and he was that kind of force also. Now that is immediately dismissed as a conspiracy theory. The remarkable thing about Meyer, and every time I'm on one of these panels, it comes up from these newspaper men. Oh, what do you have, a conspiracy theory? You see, you can say that, you'll get my question in a minute, you can say that teachers can organize and pursue their interests. And you can say that farmers can organize and pursue their interests. But the minute you imply that people who own the newspapers, the wealth, the land, the labor, and the capital, and the factories, and the industries, and the banks of this country organize and pursue their interests, you're a conspiracy theorist. Now, in contrast to the conspiracy theory, what Mr. Meyer offers us is the somnambulist theory, that they walk around in their sleep and don't care about how their billions go, don't care about what people are thinking, don't care about what ideologies are allowed, don't care about what people are columnists. And finally, in contrast, what he also offers is the coincidence theory. I wonder if he would comment, if members of the panel would comment on the coincidence theory as opposed to the conspiracy theory.
Let me just very
And I want to protest the lack of floor microphones. I think that's not very good.
Unfortunately, this room doesn't have the setup for it. I'm sorry. I just want to point out, for those who say question, we did say this was a discussion period. I'm not concerned if people want to make a statement rather than ask a specific question. I'm only concerned about the length of time that they do it in just a couple of minutes. Bill Tatum wants to respond. Alex wants to respond.
I want to respond to his statement about Oliver North and the Marines. As an ex-Marine, trained as a drill instructor, served in the Korean conflict, I resent what he said about Oliver North and you, Bill, and me. Because I was there because I believed, and I still believe, in this country of ours. I still believe in it. And I was a Marine and I volunteered. I volunteered because I believed and would volunteer again if I believed, but would refuse to serve if I did not.
Alex?
On this matter of coincidence theory, which Mike raised, I've actually had a very good illustration right here in Cambridge in the last few days. Now, on election day in Cambridge and parts of Somerville, there was a referendum proposed. And I'll briefly read you the terms because it's important to know what they said. One, they called on the district representative and the president to achieve a just and lasting peace in the Middle East by, one, demanding that Israel end its violation of Palestinian human rights and its occupation of the West Bank. Two, stopping all expenditures of U.S. taxpayers' money for Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. Three, favoring the establishment of an independent Palestinian state on the West Bank and Gaza with peace for all states in the region, including Israel. Now, as many of you no doubt know, this was very vehemently opposed by, among other things, Reps Joe Kennedy and Barney Frank. And to the surprise, I think, of all, it passed. Now, it passed by 22,784 to 20,456. Now, this, by any standard, was a very interesting political development. Actually, there were three other initiatives across the country on the same day which failed. Therefore, you have to ask yourself, here's an important political expression. How well was it reported? Well, it's not been reported to my knowledge so far on the networks, which is perhaps not surprising. It wasn't a very sizable a state episode. It wasn't reported, I didn't think, in the New York Times. Now, what about the Boston Globe? Well, the Globe, the day after, conflated the result, as I understand it, with not exactly a similar initiative that was put forward in Newton. Combined the two results and said, as a whole, a spokesman for the opponents of the thing said the referendum had been rejected. They quoted Philip Perlmutter of the Jewish Community Relations Council as saying that the organizers of the referendum were, quote, very radical and very pro-Arab. The reporter did not call on the people organizing the referendum. The next day, yesterday, the Boston Globe said that in its roundup of the reports of, various election referendums, issues, voters, said figures were not available, but the referendum had been defeated. And finally, today, we can read the following correction in the Boston Globe. Because of incorrect information provided the Globe, the wrong results were reported yesterday on non-binding question 5, calling on the US government to achieve peace in the Middle East. The measure was approved. Now, if you went through and you asked everybody involved, from the Boston Globe reporter to the editor, you said, "What happened, man? Why did you screw up like that? Why didn't you put it as an important piece of news?" They would say, "I'm sure. Pressure of events, crowd of stories, not very large vote, slipped through the cracks, reporter got it wrong, stringer wasn't there, pressure of deadline, couldn't find the guy's number." But at the end of the day,
that's exactly what they told me.
just to conclude, so there it is. Is it coincidence, or is it conspiracy, or is it business as usual?
The questioner is asking if the panel would respond to the media's treatment of Bob Woodward's book Veil, which she said is being attacked or ignored in the mainstream media. Would anyone like to respond in particular to that?
Serialized on the front page, so I don't think it applies. But maybe
I'm sorry, they can't hear you. You're not talking to the...
Oh, well, it's not important because he works for the Post, and the Post published it in the front page for about a week, but that's maybe other media did ignore it.
I'm sorry, one here and then over.
Former employee of the CIA, Ralph Begay, claimed that at one time there were several reporters several of the New York Times on the CIA payroll. William Bradley of the Post gave the lawyer at the time echoed the statement so closely to what becomes suspicious.
The questioner said that CIA agents or officers have in fact worked as journalists, and James Lemoyne and you named someone else? Brannigan appear to report so closely to the State Department press releases that they would like our comment on it. No one else is jumping. I work also for Covert Action Information Bulletin, and we've dealt with the subject of... I'm not about to say either of those men is a CIA officer. Let me preface my remarks by saying it is very true that the CIA has used journalists, sometimes only as agents, sometimes in fact regular CIA officers, although they say they don't do that now. Every time a bill has been introduced in Congress to forbid the CIA using journalists undercover, the bill has been defeated. And I would only say that in our experience there are a great many reporters who don't have to be agents to say these things. On the one hand, there are many foreign correspondents who simply erase U.S. Embassy on press releases and put their own name on it. Almost. Not, I hasten to say, for major papers like the Times or the Post, but there's a great deal, particularly of foreign coverage, which is regurgitated State Department handouts. So when you see these things that are so similar, it might bespeak a laziness more than something more sinister. I think the problem is that the intelligence agencies do have considerable influence over the press, not necessarily directly, but very often indirectly. They certainly have many, many agents working for the foreign press. Most of the reports that have been done say that the CIA has more foreign correspondents on its payroll than AP, UPI, TASS, and Reuters put together. And they probably do, and they probably have more money for it. They then spread stories which get picked up by other people, which then serve the purpose of spreading their disinformation without the end user having to be an agent. I don't think anyone else has something more to say about the specific.
Well, I'm just a little worried about there's an undertone here that, I grew up in the McCarthy period in which we had witch hunting on the right against people on the left, and I think there's a danger of the very reverse phenomenon that when you get up and without when you get up and without any corroboration suggest and question and impeach the motives of a journalist, that's witch hunting on the left, and I think it's deplorable.
I want to say something about Brannigan. I worked with him. I'm not going to...
Hold on one second, Ms. Shaw.
I can't just sit here and listen to, unsubstantiated allegations of that type against a colleague of mine. I don't happen to agree with Bill Brannigan's political point of view. When he went to Central America, I spent a lot of time talking to him, and I think he comes by his perspective and his point of view honestly, and he's a pretty conservative guy, and that's the way he sees it, and that's the way he reports it. And I really think it's slanderous to accuse someone of being a CIA agent when, and especially when there's no evidence. I have heard no evidence advanced. Well, you've certainly implied it. What else did you mean?
Yes, Bill, take it. Hold on.
We have an expression on the wall in my sitting room. It said, "You can't prove it, you can't use it." Now, we talk about CIA, we talk about a lot of things. Let me relate a story to you. At the height of the famine in Ethiopia, I was there not only as a reporter, but I was working in the field with a Polish helicopter team using a Russian plane with Swedish doctors and nurses going to the North Country to drop food in a cargo plane and going down to distribute it in a helicopter because it was mountainous country, and when we found a plateau that we could land a helicopter on, we would go there. And that's, I think, the best use of a journalist's time in a time such as that. But there was a newspaper there in the Wallo province. Well, they weren't there. They were at the bar back in Addis Ababa, a reporter from a major newspaper in America. And when we got back after a day of dropping food, I stopped by the bar and he said, "Hi." And I said, "Hi." I said, "Have you filed yet?" He said, "Yes, I filed." I said, "What did you write about today?" He said, "I wrote about cholera in Wallo." I just gotten back. I had a Dr. Savick with us on the trip from the World Health Organization. I didn't hear anything about cholera. And I said, "You've written the story and you filed it on cholera in Wallo when the coffee crop is coming in Ethiopia?" He said, "Yeah." I said, I grabbed him by the hand, took him up to Dr. Savick's room. And I said, "Dr. Savick, what is cholera? I thought you said it was dysentery." He said, "It is dysentery. Where did you get the story from that it was cholera?" He said, "There was an administrator from the camp. I saw the administrator. It was a volunteer who wouldn't know the difference between cholera and dysentery. P.S. I challenged him further and told him to change it because there was time. He didn't. And in the final analysis, the reason for it was the difference between page 1 or 2 and page 36. Now, this happened. I don't know how many of you were in Ethiopia during this time, but I had dropped down into an area where thousands of people were actually dying. And the number one cash crop for Ethiopia is Ethiopian coffee. They say it's a Marxist country. Yet, one of the most capitalistic things I've ever seen occurs in the streets of Ethiopia is salesmen. The reason that it becomes a Marxist country is that the government gets better treatment from the Eastern Bloc than it does from our own country. Now, they have statues of Marx and Lenin and Engels in all the squares, and they have to guard them to keep the people from tearing them down. It's not a Marxist country. But we have this fiction in America that the people of Ethiopia are Marxist, and that puts a communistic spin on the country, and it makes it very difficult for things to happen positively out of Ethiopia in terms of the people there being helped. And even now, the famine is almost as bad as it was 4 years ago. But I must say, in reporting this, that almost all the food that went to Ethiopia came from the United States of America. Almost all the food that came. So what I'm saying is, there may be people who are CIA agents. There may be. But they don't need CIA agents. If you have somebody who will take a story and put that kind of spin on it for the sake of getting a page one story and not having anything within it that rebels against that kind of thing when a people are in so much trouble.
There's someone over here. Okay, 1 second.
This is a meeting on anti-communism in the United States, effect on the press. I think one of the consequences of anti-communism has been the establishment of the instigation agency, the CIA, the FBI, and so forth, all of which have had tremendous influence on American thinking. In 1976, the Church Committee pointed out that 1,000 books had been written under CIA aegis. Now, it's less important whether somebody is being paid off by the CIA directly or whether he is being rewarded. And I think that the process of reward is going on all the time. I will give you 2 examples. One is from my own field, which is psychiatry. Howard Rome, Dr. Howard Rome, was the psychiatrist who treated Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway was broken down after 30 years of persecution by the FBI, and Dr. Rome reported to the FBI on his treatment of Hemingway. Dr. Rome is now the editor of the most important and most influential psychiatric, non-organizational psychiatric journal. Second, on the New York Times, you mentioned about Schanberg. If Schanberg had been still on the Times, you wouldn't be writing about Kant. He'd be out. However, he unfortunately hadn't happened. Now, there's another, on the other side, Philip Chino. I have had personal experience with 2 of his stories, and this is not CIA, this is state corruption, where murders, one was involved murder, and the other involved gross misrepresentation by Chino. He was grossly wrong. I think he lied, but I can't be sure. But he is now the person who is reporting on the intelligence agencies for the Times. Now, we talked about monolithic stuff. There's one area where America is as misinformed as the Germans were about the Jews. That's the area of AIDS. Now, both Bill and Bill Tatum have published stuff that I've written on this question of AIDS, but it's utterly monolithic.
Are you Dr. Lerman?
Yes.
Hi, Dr. Lerman. How are you?
Sir.
Yes, we have pretty good material.
But I think, thanks particularly to these 2 gentlemen, despite the major press, we're going to break through, and I'm going to tell you that on the 16th of December, there's going to be a big meeting in the Bronx, and there is a leaflet about it.
Someone said upstairs, I can't see a thing. Is there someone over there? Oh, way upstairs. Yes, ma'am.
A rephrasing of the panel, and that is
question for the panel is, how can we change who sets the agenda? What role does the public play in that? Is there someone who wants to?
Oh, well, I've been speaking a lot. Maybe you...
Why don't you go first then, Joanne?
I'll start by saying it's really hard.
You gotta talk first.
I said I'll start by saying that's really hard to do. And even despite the illusion that, at least in papers that I'm familiar with, there's a willingness to listen, that really is a lot. There's really a lot of illusion in that. But there are some ways that I know people have been a little successful at the Globe, and that is they come in and they meet with editors. And the more they call up and the more they agitate and the more they come in and meet, somehow some of what they say gets filtered in. It doesn't necessarily mean that stories or opinions or articles or whatever result, but there's a heightened awareness that there is a different point of view, because one of the points that I think was alluded to but not said is that the arrogance comes in from people thinking that there's only one point of view that's correct, and that happens to be the point of view of a minority of people in the world, but a majority of people in America that is a white male point of view from middle class perspectives. And so the arrogance usually is to leave out all the other points of view. And when there is a constant but rational disagreement that those points of views aren't the only one, sometimes they get listened to.
Alex? Well, hold on. Alex wanted... I'm sorry? I'm sure we do. Alex wanted to comment on the previous question, however.
Well, I think there are a number of stages. The first one is obviously criticism. For a long period, I think the right had a monopoly of that, a virtual monopoly in the form of Reed Irvine and accuracy in media. Actually, if we're to believe the latest book on A.M. Rosenthal at the New York Times, Irvine had quite an effect on the outlook of Salzburger, the owner, at one point. I don't know if that's true or not. And I think gradually now, oddly enough, at the end of at least the Reagan, not the Reagan-Bush period, the liberals and the left have got their act together a bit with the formation of Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting and a few other organizations like that. There is no doubt that one does need countervailing pressure from the left, at least so the journalists in the middle can say, well, I'm getting it from both sides, which I think is generally a deplorable cop-out, but does hold people sometimes in the center. The second point, I think, is the growth of the alternative press. I think there's a limit to what that can be done in terms of criticism. I think in terms of pressuring things like Channel 13, the decline of public television, the person mentioned television, has been particularly signal and deplorable in the recent period. And it's also true, I think, that pressure on the local stations who subscribe to something abominable like, I don't know, the McNeil-Lehrer show, to say, why do they systematically exclude from the people they talk to about 83% of the American political spectrum? For example, organized labor is barely ever seen on McNeil-Lehrer in any shape or form. This is, by the way, something people talk about, the rich variety available to the consumer of news. If you're looking for any news about the American labor movement, which does, after all, contain 13 million people, you'll look a very long time indeed. The final point really comes down to political parties and political movements. I think in the end, sometimes people think if they could get Noam Chomsky to run NBC News, it'd all be okay. Or Bill Schaap, or whoever. Obviously, it would not be. In the end, political parties set agendas, and newspapers can be in lockstep with that party or whatever. But the existence of a party, for example, take another thing that's hard to find on the American mainstream agenda, a discussion of socialized medicine. Now, in social democratic countries, even in Canada, political parties have been part of the struggle to produce some kind of socialized medicine. Therefore, it is on the general agenda for a reporter to actually discuss it. You can look a very long time indeed through the American press and ever discover or find any opinion saying that actually national health insurance in any kind of form, not the form presented by the governor of the state, I'm sorry to say, will not be there. So in the end, you can never say that the media in and of itself, I think, will produce major change. You have to have the political party.
Just a footnote.
Okay, 1 second.
Just a footnote. 6 months ago, the Times published an editorial calling for national health insurance and not in the Dukakis form.
Good. Somebody way up there? Yeah.
About 2 months ago, a Cambridge study group made a report on the Nazis in the Republican Party, which got published in the Globe one day and followed up a few days later about some people who left the Bush campaign, 6 or 7 of them. I understand from the people who made the report, they sent out hundreds all over the country. Last I heard, only 2 or 3 papers picked it up. Last Friday, the Boston Globe had an 8th Bush staff, Nazi East European Nazi collaborators who left the campaign. Why didn't this get into the press? We had 7, 8 weeks of time. It's not a new allegation of some CIA agent. These are guys with 50 years of history that we know about.
Hold on. The question is, why did the story, which apparently broke and got some coverage in the Boston Globe about former Nazis, I take it you're talking about not neo-Nazis, but oldo-Nazis, in the Bush campaign in one way or another, why was that not picked up anywhere? Was it? Does someone say, in fact, it was picked up?
It was. That's right.
Listen, I don't know what planet these people are living in. We had several stories on that. We had an editorial referring to those guys.
Hold it. Wait, I'm sorry. It's very hard to hear.
I remember the stories.
I think we're going to get a little bit too diffuse if we simply are going to holler about our favorite censored story. Let me get a couple more questioners, then I think we have to go. There's one person here, then I want to get someone back over there. Okay, down here.
I'd like to know about a story that's been terribly downplayed.
All right.
I'd like to know about a story that's been terribly downplayed in the U.S. press, and it's about the Office of Public Diplomacy for Latin America and the Caribbean, which was the most pernicious domestic propaganda campaign operative in the executive branch of the United States government, probably in history. But all we've had is just kind of simple denials that it was effective. But Alex referred to Noam Chomsky's piece as being standing in testimony to the efficacy of the OPD in terms of completely squashing the debate on Nicaragua. So I'd like to know why, for the anti-conspiracy theorists up here, why that story has been downplayed and why they refuse to look at something that's a real conspiracy and admit it and admit its effectiveness.
Yeah, I'd just like to take up something here on the conspiracy theory business. Back in 1980, I taught a course at the Fletcher School, an establishment institution at Tufts University. I was in a plane, and I happened to be sitting next to Mark Raskin of the Institute of Policy Studies, and I told him I was looking for some good speakers for this course. He said, "Why don't you have Noam Chomsky?" He said, "You know, Chomsky has made a great study of the coverage, or the lack of coverage, of East Timor." And I have to confess that when Mark told me this was in 1980, I wasn't really quite sure what East Timor was, and I got very interested. Well, Chomsky came around to this class, And I have to say that despite my prior conception, I never met him before, that despite the ferocity of his views, of his doctrines and philosophy, the civility and courtesy, the almost elaborate courtesy of his manner, won me and the students over. And he made a very powerful case that because of the bias in the press, that because East Timor was an allied country to the United States, that the press underplayed the fact that the Indonesian government annexed, that Indonesia was an allied country, that they had annexed this former Portuguese colony in 1975. And that if you compare it, for example, with Cambodia, where there was acreage of things, that this was a communist atrocity, whereas the other was not a communist atrocity. Well, I got quite interested in this, and I went to talk to the then deputy foreign editor of the Times. And I said, we've had very poor coverage on this. And he said, you're absolutely right. There are a dozen atrocities around the world that we don't cover. This is one for various reasons. So I took it up. I wrote first an editorial called An Unjust War in East Timor. And I treasure the letter I got from Chomsky. He said, I'm a hard man to please. I have no criticism of your editorial. It had a map, and it said exactly what the whole thing had happened. We then ran a dozen other editorials on it. They were read, they were entered in the congressional record, and several congressmen then took up the cause, and then something was done in Congress as a result of this. But I want to tell you the background of it. When Chomsky came around, he had with him a file of all the coverage in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and other papers of East Timor. And he would go to the meticulous degree that if, for example, the London Times had a piece on East Timor, and then it appeared in the New York Times, that if a paragraph was cut out, he'd compare and he'd say, look, this key paragraph right near the end, which is really what tells the whole story, was left out of the New York Times version of the London Times thing. So I said to Chomsky at the time, I said, well, it may be that you're misinterpreting ignorance, haste, deadline pressure, etc., for some kind of determined effort to suppress an element of the story. He said, Mr. Meyer, if that happened once, I would agree with that, but if it happens twice, three, and in my case, he said, I've actually found this happen 5 times. I laughed, and I said, Mr. Chomsky, 5 times. It happens 5 times. It happens 100 times. Now, the point that I'm trying to say is that the number one, that Chomsky had a point, that we then did something about it, and one would have thought, given the gravity of what we were doing in breaking an establishment silence on this, that at least either Haig or Schultz would have been on the phone saying, why are you finally running these troublemaking editorials on this atrocity in Indonesia? The sad thing that happened is that there was virtually no reaction. There was no reaction in part because, and this is something that the left may find it hard to accept, that in the United Nations it's always easy to get a resolution against Israel. It is impossible to get a resolution naming a country against another third world nation. And that the United Nations did nothing about it. Nothing has gone on. It's now 15 years. I say this by way of a case study, a small case study, to show that however impervious the institution may seem from the outside, it's not true that if you make a reasoned case on the merit to someone in there who takes it seriously and listens to it, they will try and do something about it. So when the question comes up, what can you do about something you don't like? Do just what Chomsky did, and I think you can get a response.